She was drowning, and no one was coming to save her. The Pacific Ocean had a way of humbling even the strongest swimmers, and Sarah Chen had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the riptide. Her lungs were burning, her limbs growing heavy, and the beach that had seemed so close moments ago was now slipping away into a blur of sand and distant umbrellas. The water was cold, colder than she'd expected, and it was pulling her down with an insistence that felt almost personal, almost deliberate. She had tried to swim parallel to the shore like the lifeguard had taught her in that beach safety class she'd attended 5 years ago, but her body wouldn't obey anymore. Panic was setting in now, that primal fear that overrides logic and reason. She was going to die here, on a Saturday afternoon, in front of hundreds of people who were too busy with their phones and their drinks, and their conversations to notice that a woman was drowning in plain sight. It was the cruelest kind of irony, and it was about to become her epitaph. That's when she saw the figure cutting through the water toward her. At first, she thought maybe it was a lifeguard, finally responding to something she didn't remember screaming. But as the figure got closer, she realized it was a man, older than her, well-built, moving through the water with the kind of desperation that suggested he wasn't trained for water rescue. He was taking risks, swimming against the current instead of with it, fighting the ocean like it was an enemy he could defeat through sheer willpower. His face came into focus as he reached her, and for a moment, Sarah almost laughed despite the water filling her throat. He was handsome. Even drowning, even as the darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision, she had time to notice that he was strikingly handsome. Chiseled features, dark hair plastered to his forehead, blue eyes that were wide with concern and determination. Marcus Ashford had never been the hero type. He was the kind of man who wrote checks and made phone calls and solved problems from the comfort of an air-conditioned office. He was the kind of billionaire who had security detail, personal assistants, and a team of lawyers ready to handle any crisis. But in that moment, standing on Malibu Beach with a drink in his hand, watching a woman go under for what looked like the third time, something ancient and primal woke up inside him. He didn't think about the fact that he wasn't a trained rescuer. He didn't consider the liability or the risk, or any of the 17 things his lawyers would tell him not to do. He simply handed his drink to the nearest stranger and ran into the ocean. The water was colder than he expected, but the shock of it cleared his mind. He could see her there, maybe 30 feet out, and she was going under. Marcus had learned to swim as a child in his family's private pool, but that was a different creature entirely from the Pacific Ocean in the grip of a riptide. Still, he pushed forward, his body moving on pure instinct. When he reached her, she was barely conscious, her movements becoming sluggish and disconnected from any conscious effort to survive. He grabbed her from behind, wrapping his arm around her chest the way he vaguely remembered from some lifeguard training video he'd watched while eating lunch years ago. The way back to shore was harder than the way out. His arms burned, his lungs screamed for air, and the woman in his arms had gone limp and heavy. He couldn't tell if she was breathing. He couldn't tell if she was alive. That was the thought that drove him forward more than anything else. He couldn't save her just to have her die in his arms on the journey back to shore. By the time his feet touched sand, a crowd had gathered. He was barely aware of it. His entire world narrowed down to the woman he was carrying. Someone was shouting about calling 911. Someone else was taking photos, because apparently that was what people did now when faced with human tragedy. Marcus stumbled to the sand and gently lowered Sarah onto her back, remembering something about checking for a pulse. His hands were shaking. He wasn't sure if it was from the cold water or from the terror of losing her right there on the beach. Sarah coughed. It was the most beautiful sound Marcus Ashford had ever heard. She coughed and retched and expelled what felt like half of the Pacific Ocean from her lungs, and he had never been more relieved about anything in his life. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, and when she looked up at him, he felt something in his chest shift and rearrange itself in ways he didn't fully understand. The paramedics arrived within minutes. The beach patrol was already there, running toward them with the practiced efficiency of people who knew what they were doing. But Marcus didn't move away from Sarah until she was being loaded into the ambulance. He held her hand for as long as possible, and when the paramedic told him she was going to be okay, that she'd been conscious long enough that she hadn't aspirated too much water, He felt the tension drain from his shoulders like someone had pulled a plug. The news of the rescue spread quickly. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. A woman had nearly drowned at Malibu Beach, and a mysterious man had pulled her to safety. The photos started circulating, though most of them were blurry and taken from too far away to identify anyone. The news stations were calling him a hero, and for the first time in years, Marcus Ashford was being described as something other than a brilliant businessman or a ruthless billionaire. He was being described as good. It was a strange feeling, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. He visited Sarah in the hospital the day after the rescue. She was in a private room on the third floor, and she was looking considerably better than she had on the beach. Her eyes were clear now, and when she saw him entering the room, her face lit up with a recognition that went beyond simple gratitude. "That's him," she said softly. "You're the one who saved my life." Marcus shook his head, uncomfortable with the weight of that statement. "I just did what anyone would have done." He was lying, and they both knew it. Most people would have called the lifeguard. Most people would have stayed on the shore and waited for someone else to take action. But he didn't say that. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed, and they talked for hours about nothing in particular. She told him about her job as a graphic designer. She told him about how she'd been trying to get in better shape, hence the swimming. She told him about her dreams of starting her own design studio, but how she'd never had the capital to do it. Marcus found himself really listening to her, which was something he rarely did anymore. In his world, people mostly wanted things from him. They wanted money, connections, endorsements, or just the cachet of being associated with his name. But Sarah was different. She didn't ask him for anything. She didn't even ask him his name until late in the afternoon, and when he told her, she just nodded thoughtfully, as if Marcus Ashford the billionaire and Marcus the man who had saved her were two separate people who just happened to share a body. He gave her his number before he left, telling her to call if she needed anything. She promised she wouldn't, but they both knew she was lying. He wanted her to call. He wanted to see her again. And as he walked out of the hospital and back to his waiting car, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt hopeful. He felt like maybe, just maybe, something was shifting in his life. Something real. Something that didn't have anything to do with quarterly earnings reports or hostile takeovers. What he didn't know was that the woman he'd just pulled from the ocean had been watching him for the past 3 years. That she knew exactly who he was. That she had helped him in ways that would have astonished him. And that she had been waiting for him to understand what she already knew with absolute certainty. That they were connected in ways that went far deeper than a random rescue on a beach. Sarah Chen had been 26 years old when she met Marcus Ashford for the first time. Well, not technically met. He had no idea who she was, which was exactly how she preferred it. She was working at a small venture capital firm at the time, a junior analyst making barely enough to help her mother with the mortgage, and still have a little left over for herself. The firm was called Greenpoint Capital, and it was run by a man named David Chen, who was no relation to her despite sharing a last name. David had taken her on as an intern, and then, seeing that she actually knew how to analyze market trends and spot potential opportunities, he'd promoted her to junior analyst. It was in that role that she first encountered Marcus Ashford. He had come to Greenpoint with a proposal that everyone at the firm, including David, had immediately dismissed. It was too ambitious. It was too risky. The market wasn't ready for it. The technology wasn't there yet. The list of reasons to reject the proposal went on, and Marcus had listened to all of them with a patience that suggested he'd heard these objections many times before. But Sarah had seen something that everyone else had missed. She had looked at his proposal for an innovative software platform that would revolutionize how companies managed their supply chains, and she had seen genius. She had seen the future. While everyone else in the conference room was shaking their heads and muttering about red flags, she had been doing the math in her head, running scenarios, and realizing that this was something special. This was something that could work. After the meeting, when David and the other partners were laughing about the audacity of the proposal, Sarah had gone back to her desk and done something that would probably get her fired if anyone found out. She had hacked into the firm's investment fund. Not technically hacked, because she had access to all the files as part of her job, but she had taken $1 million of her own money, the money that represented 4 years of savings, an aggressive cutting of corners on everything from rent to food, and she had invested it in Marcus Ashford's company. She had done it quietly, anonymously, through a series of shell corporations and fake names that she'd carefully constructed. She had made it look like it came from outside the firm, like it was some mysterious investor who believed in his vision. At the time, she had justified it to herself as an investment. She was young, she was brilliant with numbers, and she had analyzed his proposal to death. She knew it would work, she knew he would make it work, and she was right. Over the next 3 years, Marcus had transformed his software company into a juggernaut. It had expanded beyond his original vision, had gone public, had made him richer than anyone would have imagined possible. And Sarah, with her $1 million investment made anonymously, had become wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. She had left Greenpint Capital within a year of making the investment, right around the time that Marcus's company had started showing its first signs of real success. She couldn't stay there. The knowledge of what she'd done was eating her alive, and being in the same city as Marcus Ashford, knowing that she'd changed his life and that he would never know, was an ache that was becoming unbearable. So she'd quit and moved to California. She'd started working as a freelance graphic designer, which was actually her first love, but something she'd put on hold to pursue more lucrative work. Now she could afford to do what she wanted, and what she wanted was to be somewhere that she could breathe. Somewhere that Marcus Ashford's success wasn't a daily reminder of her own impossible situation. She had wanted to fade into the background of her own life, to be happy in obscurity, to let her investment grow and mature without her having to think about it every single day. It had been working for a while. She'd built a life in California. She had friends. She had a career she loved. She had even started talking to a therapist about the guilt and the complexity of what she'd done. The therapist had helped her understand that what she'd done wasn't wrong, exactly. It was an investment. It was a risk. It was her money, and she was free to do with it as she pleased. But it was also, the therapist had suggested, something that Sarah might need to come to terms with eventually. She had changed someone's life. She had shaped his destiny. And somewhere deep down, Sarah knew that this knowledge was going to consume her until she did something about it. And then Marcus had pulled her from the ocean, and something inside her had shifted. He had risked his own life for her, without knowing anything about her. He hadn't known that she was the person who had made his entire existence as a billionaire possible. He hadn't known that she had been watching his ascent from a distance, following his company's progress, reading every article written about him, collecting them like some sort of bizarre stalker, which she knew was unhealthy and weird, and something she probably should have addressed in therapy months ago. But when he had looked down at her on that beach, when she had looked up into those blue eyes and seen genuine concern, something had broken open inside her. She had wanted to tell him right then. She had wanted to say, "I know who you are, and I know what I did, and I've been watching you for 3 years, and I need you to understand that I changed your life." But instead, she had coughed up seawater and tried to remember how to breathe, and by the time she could form words, he was gone, and the moment had passed. In the hospital, she had almost told him multiple times. She had opened her mouth, and the words had been right there, ready to fall out, and then she had lost her nerve. What would she say? What could she possibly say that wouldn't make her sound insane? He would think she was delusional. He would think she was a stalker or a con artist trying to gain some kind of leverage over him. He would never understand that what she'd done had come from a place of genuine belief in him, not from any desire to control or manipulate him. So instead, she had let him leave, and she had sat in that hospital bed, and she had made a decision. She was going to find a way to tell him the truth. She was going to find a way to explain what she'd done and why she'd done it, and if he rejected her or hated her or wanted nothing to do with her, then at least she would know that she'd tried. At least she would know that she'd taken the risk. Marcus called her 3 days after she was discharged from the hospital. She was home, back in her small but comfortable apartment in Santa Monica, when her phone rang and his name appeared on the screen. Her heart nearly stopped. He asked her how she was feeling. He asked if she was recovering well. He asked if she wanted to have dinner with him, a proper dinner, not in a hospital room with monitors beeping in the background. She said yes before her brain had a chance to talk her out of it. They met at a restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, a place that was fancy but not ostentatiously so, The kind of place where a billionaire could eat without being mobbed by cameras or admirers. He was waiting for her at the table when she arrived, and when he stood up to pull out her chair, she felt that same flutter in her chest that she'd felt on the beach. This was a man who had no idea who she really was. This was a man who was looking at her with interest and attraction, and something that might have been the beginning of real feelings. They talked for hours. He told her about his business, about the software platform that had changed everything, about the moment he'd realized that his company was going to be huge. She listened intently, nodding in all the right places, and she wanted desperately to tell him that she had been part of that moment, that his success had been possible because of her. But she didn't. Instead, she let him talk, and she watched his face light up when he talked about work, and she realized with a start that she was falling in love with him. Or maybe she had already been in love with him. Maybe that was what this entire 3-year obsession had been. Not stalking or creepiness or anything unhealthy, but love. The kind of love where you believe in someone so much that you're willing to put your life savings on the line to prove it. The kind of love where you follow their career from thousands of miles away and feel their victories like they're your own. The kind of love where you're willing to drown in the Pacific Ocean to have him save you, because at least then you would be in his life. At least then he would know your name. After dinner, he drove her back to her apartment. He walked her to the door, and she thought for a moment that he might kiss her. His eyes were searching her face, and his hand was gentle on her arm, and she was holding her breath waiting for it. But instead, he just told her that he wanted to see her again. She said yes again, and he promised to call, and then he was gone, walking back down the hallway toward the elevator, and she was left standing in her doorway wondering how on earth she was going to handle this. Over the next month, they saw each other constantly. Marcus seemed to be remaking his schedule to fit her in, which shocked her because she knew who he was, she knew how busy he was, she knew that he was one of the most sought-after men in the country. But apparently, he wanted to spend his time with her. They would have coffee in the mornings before work. They would meet for lunch in hidden corners of the city where no one would recognize him. They would have dinner at night, sometimes at fancy restaurants, sometimes at her small apartment where she cooked for him. She was falling deeper in love with him every single day, and the weight of her secret was becoming unbearable. She knew she had to tell him. She knew that if this relationship was going to go anywhere, he had to know the truth. But every time she tried, she would look at his face, and she would think about how happy he was, and she would wonder if telling him would ruin everything. What if he felt like she had manipulated him? What if he thought she'd orchestrated the entire rescue to get close to him? What if he thought she was trying to claim credit for his success? It was the question that kept her awake at night. The question that made her palms sweat and her stomach twist into knots. And it was the question that she finally decided to answer on a Saturday night, almost exactly 1 month after he had pulled her from the ocean. Marcus had invited her to his penthouse for the first time. It was a sprawling apartment on the top floor of one of the most exclusive buildings in Los Angeles, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city like it was his personal kingdom. He had cooked for her, which had surprised her because she'd assumed billionaires had personal chefs, but apparently Marcus Ashford was full of surprises. He had made pasta from scratch, and it was actually good, and they had eaten at a table overlooking the glittering lights of Los Angeles, and it had felt like something out of a movie. After dinner, he had taken her hand and led her to the window. The city spread out before them like a circuit board of light and possibility, and she felt small and insignificant and very, very afraid. This was it. This was the moment. She had to tell him now, or she was going to explode from the pressure of keeping this secret. "I need to tell you something," she had said, and she had felt his hand tense in hers. He had probably thought she was going to tell him that she didn't want to see him anymore. He had probably thought she was breaking up with him, but what she'd actually done was worse, in some ways. She had told him the entire story. She had told him about the meeting at Greenpoint Capital. She had told him about seeing something in his proposal that everyone else had missed. She had told him about her $1 million investment made through shell corporations and fake names. She had told him about moving to California to get away from the guilt and the complexity of what she'd done. She had told him about watching his rise to billionaire status from a distance, about following his career with the intensity of an obsessed fan. She had told him about the drowning, and how she'd almost told him then, and how she couldn't keep the secret anymore. He hadn't said anything for a long time. He had just stood there, looking out at the city, holding her hand, and she had felt her heart slowly sinking deeper and deeper into her chest. She had ruined it. She had ruined everything. He was going to hate her. He was going to feel like she had manipulated him, that she had orchestrated every moment of their relationship to try to somehow claim credit for his success, or to leverage her investment into something more. And then he had turned to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. Not angry tears, not betrayed tears, but something else entirely. He had pulled her close, and he had held her like he might break if he wasn't careful, and he had told her that she had no idea what this meant to him. That for 3 years, he had been haunted by the fact that his company's success had come from a mysterious investor who had funded him at exactly the right moment, when everyone else had rejected him. That he had hired private investigators to try to figure out who it was. That he had tried everything to track down this person who believed in him when no one else did, because he had wanted to thank them, to tell them that what they had done had changed his life, not just in terms of money, but in terms of believing that he was worth something, that his ideas mattered, that he wasn't just some crazy dreamer with an impossible vision. He had wanted to meet this investor his entire adult life, and here she was, standing in his living room, telling him that it had been her all along. He had looked at her like she was something miraculous, something precious, something that he couldn't believe was real. "I don't know what to say," he had told her. "I spent 3 years looking for you, and you were right in front of me, and I didn't even know. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life thanking you, whether you want me to or not." They had kissed then, and it had felt like everything in the universe had suddenly aligned. It had felt like coming home. It had felt like destiny, if Sarah believed in that sort of thing. And as his mouth moved against hers, as his hands came up to frame her face, as she felt the absolute certainty of his affection, she had realized that this was what she had been waiting for all along. Not the investment or the money or any of the material aspects of what she'd done. Just this moment. Just him. But that was their secret. That was the thing that only they knew. And it remained their secret for the next 3 months, as their relationship deepened and became more serious. They moved in together. They went public as a couple. They appeared together at charity events and company functions, and no one suspected that Sarah Chen, the beautiful woman on Marcus Ashford's arm, was the person who had made his entire empire possible. The problem came when Marcus's business partner, a man named Richard Hale, started digging into the early days of the company. Richard had been with Marcus since the beginning, had watched the company grow from a startup to a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and had grown increasingly paranoid about the fact that someone, somewhere, had put in $1 million at exactly the right moment to keep them afloat when they were on the verge of bankruptcy. He had decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with actual concern and everything to do with ego and greed, that if he could figure out who the mystery investor was, he could use that information to his advantage. He could blackmail them. He could cut them out and claim their shares for himself. He could do 1,000 petty, horrible things that would make his position in the company more secure. Marcus didn't know about Richard's investigation. Sarah knew, because Richard had foolishly tried to pump her for information at a company gala, asking her oblique questions about her background and her career history, trying to figure out if she had the kind of financial resources to make that kind of investment. She had deflected him easily enough, but she had understood immediately that the secret was in danger of being exposed. And she had known that when it was, the narrative would be controlled by Richard, and the story would become something ugly and complicated instead of the beautiful thing it actually was. So she had done something that she would probably regret for the rest of her life. She had gone to Richard's assistant, a young woman named Melissa, who was desperately underpaid and desperately unhappy in her job, and she had offered her a substantial sum of money to delete Richard's investigation files before he could present them to anyone at the company. Melissa had agreed, and the investigation had disappeared like it had never happened. Sarah thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. Richard, discovering that his files had been deleted, had assumed that Marcus had done it, and he had confronted Marcus in his office one afternoon, accusing him of covering up something about the company's finances. Marcus had told him he was being paranoid and delusional, and Richard, unable to prove anything but certain that there was something being hidden from him, had decided to take matters into his own hands. He had gone to the SEC. He had filed a complaint claiming that there were improprieties in the company's financial reporting. He had suggested, without any evidence whatsoever, that Marcus was hiding something about the early funding of the company. The SEC investigation had come quickly after that. It wasn't a major thing, just a routine inquiry, but it was still an investigation, and it had caught everyone's attention. The media had picked up on it, as they always did, and suddenly everyone was speculating about whether Marcus Ashford, the billionaire boy wonder, had been involved in some kind of financial impropriety. The stock had dipped slightly. Some of his business partners had started to distance themselves. And Marcus, sitting in his office with the news on his screen, had realized that something was very wrong. He had called Sarah into his office at home one evening, and he had asked her point blank if she had anything to do with Richard's investigation disappearing. She had hesitated for maybe half a second too long, and he had known immediately. He had looked at her like he didn't recognize her, and she had felt her heart start to break. "Why would you do that?" he had asked, and his voice had been very quiet and very controlled, which was somehow worse than if he had yelled. "Because Richard was going to expose us," she had said. "He was going to tell everyone, and he was going to make it sound like something dirty, and I couldn't let that happen. So instead, you obstructed an investigation. Do you understand how illegal that is? Do you understand that I'm now the subject of an SEC inquiry because of what you did?" "I was trying to protect you," she had said, and it sounded weak even to her own ears. "You lied to me," Marcus had said. "You say you wanted to tell me the truth, but then you go behind my back and do something like this. How am I supposed to trust you?" And that was the moment when Sarah had realized that by trying to protect their secret, she had destroyed the very thing that the secret was supposed to protect. She had broken his trust. She had made him doubt her. And worse, she had created the exact kind of legal and financial complications that she had been trying to avoid in the first place. The SEC investigation had eventually cleared Marcus of any wrongdoing. Melissa had apparently had a crisis of conscience and had gone to Marcus's lawyers and told them everything about the deleted files and Sarah's involvement. And Marcus, faced with the choice of protecting his relationship with Sarah or protecting his company, had chosen his company. He had told her that they needed some time apart. He had told her that he needed to think about whether they could recover from this. And Sarah, understanding that she deserved every bit of this consequence, had moved out of his penthouse and back into her small apartment in Santa Monica. For 3 months, they didn't speak. She didn't try to contact him. He didn't try to contact her. And she spent those 3 months working on her graphic design business, which had flourished without her having to do very much at all, because apparently having a billion-dollar investment account made it very easy to take on only the projects she actually wanted to work on. She helped struggling startups with their branding. She mentored young designers who were trying to break into the field. She tried very hard not to think about Marcus Ashford or the way his eyes had looked when he told her that he didn't know if he could trust her anymore. And then one day, about 3 months after she'd moved out, she was at a coffee shop downtown, working on a branding project for a small sustainability startup, when a man sat down at her table without asking. It took her a moment to recognize him because he looked different somehow. Older maybe, more tired, but it was Marcus, and he was looking at her like he had looked at her on the beach, like she was something he had been desperately searching for and had finally found. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble. And she knew, before he even continued, that he wasn't apologizing for being angry with her or for asking her to move out. He was apologizing for letting what she had done come between them. "I've had 3 months to think about it," he continued, "and I've realized something. You made a mistake. You made several mistakes, actually. You shouldn't have gone behind my back. You shouldn't have obstructed an investigation. You shouldn't have lied to me about it. But you made those mistakes because you were trying to protect me and protect us. And yes, they were bad decisions. But they came from a place of love, not malice. And I was so angry that I forgot that." She had started crying then, right there in the coffee shop, and he had reached across the table and taken her hand. And he had told her that if she was willing to go to therapy with him, if she was willing to work through this with professional help, if she was willing to be honest with him about everything, even the hard stuff, especially the hard stuff, then he wanted to try again. He wanted to build something real with her. Something that wasn't based on secret investments, or mysterious saviors, or anything other than genuine love and trust, and the willingness to be vulnerable with another person. She had said yes, of course, and they had gone back to his penthouse, and they had talked for hours about what had happened and what they wanted to happen next. They had decided that they would eventually have to go public with the truth about her investment. That Richard Hale would probably use it as ammunition again someday, but they would handle it together. They would control the narrative. They would make sure that people understood that Sarah hadn't done anything wrong. That she had simply been a brilliant investor who had believed in something before anyone else did. That she had taken a risk, and that risk had paid off. And now she was building her own life alongside the man whose success she had made possible. By the time they went public with the story, 6 months later, it had mostly stopped being interesting to the media. Yes, there was the shocking revelation that Marcus Ashford's secret benefactor had been the beautiful woman on his arm the entire time. Yes, there were articles written about how she had anonymously invested $1 million in his startup when everyone else had rejected him. Yes, people were fascinated by the romance of it all, by the idea that love had literally saved his life and launched his company into the stratosphere. But the narrative, because they controlled it, was ultimately a positive one. Sarah Chen was painted as a visionary investor, not a mysterious stalker. Marcus Ashford was painted as someone who had been worthy of her faith, not as a victim of some elaborate scheme. And their love story, because that's what it was when stripped down to its essence, became the kind of thing that inspired people, that made them believe in fate and destiny and the possibility of real human connection. Years passed. They got married on a beach not far from where he had pulled her from the water. They had children, 3 of them, all with his blue eyes and her sharp intellect. They built lives alongside each other, not parallel to each other, but genuinely intertwined. Marcus's company continued to grow and diversify. Sarah's design business became an agency that employed hundreds of people. They became known not just individually, but as a couple, as a team, as 2 people who had managed to transform a moment of crisis into a lifetime of genuine partnership. And sometimes, when they would take their children to that beach, when they would look out at the Pacific Ocean and remember the day that everything had changed, Sarah would think about how close she had come to never telling him the truth. She would think about how different her life would have been if she had just let the moment pass, if she had just let him go on believing that he had saved her for altruistic reasons when in fact, the truth was far more complicated and far more real than that. Because the real truth, the one that they both knew but rarely spoke about, was that they had saved each other. He had pulled her from the water, yes, but she had given him permission to believe in himself before anyone else did. She had put her entire financial future on the line because she had faith in his vision. She had transformed a moment of weakness into a moment of connection. And he had transformed her investment from a gesture of desperation into the foundation for a life together that was more beautiful and more real than she could have ever imagined. The billionaire and the woman who made him. Or maybe the woman who saved herself by saving him. Or maybe it was never that simple, and it was always more about 2 people finding each other at exactly the right moment and being brave enough eventually to be honest about what that meant. Whatever the narrative, whatever the story that the world told about them, Sarah knew the truth. She knew that love was real. She knew that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt if both people were willing to do the work. She knew that sometimes the best investments weren't financial at all, but emotional, spiritual, about believing in another human being enough to take risks for them. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had done the right thing when she had pulled Marcus Ashford from the ocean of his own potential and given him a reason to believe that he was worth saving. Because in saving him, she had saved herself. And in building a life with him, she had finally found the home that she had been searching for her entire life. But there was something else, something that lived in the quiet moments between Sarah and Marcus, something that neither of them had fully articulated even after all these years. It was the question that haunted them both in different ways, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, in the car rides when the children were occupied with their tablets and the radio played softly in the background. The question was this: what if she had never gone to that beach that day? What if the timing had been different by even 5 minutes? What if Marcus had drowned, Or what if she had chosen to ignore his struggling form in the water because she was too afraid, too weak, too caught up in her own desperation? These were the thoughts that Sarah couldn't quite shake, even as she sat beside him at charity galas and business dinners, where they were celebrated as the power couple of the modern age. Even as photographers snapped their pictures and journalists asked them about the story, always the story of how they met, how fate had intervened, how their love was a testament to something larger than themselves. She would smile for the cameras. She would tell the version of events that had become comfortable, that had become the narrative they had agreed upon in the early days of their relationship, when everything was still too raw and too complicated to explain fully. But in her private moments, when she sat in her office overlooking the city, when she reviewed the financial statements of her design agency and saw the numbers climbing higher and higher, Sarah found herself thinking about the woman she had been before Marcus. That woman had been desperate, yes, but she had also been resourceful. That woman had seen an opportunity and had taken it, not because she was calculating or cynical, but because she had believed in something. She had believed that Marcus Ashford, with his brilliant mind and his innovative ideas, deserved a chance. She had believed that the world would be better if his company existed. She had believed in the power of taking a risk, of putting everything on the line, of betting on a person. And the version of Sarah that existed now, the married version, the successful version, the mother of three who had achieved everything she had ever dreamed of, that version of Sarah sometimes felt like she was living in a different body, wearing a different life, as though the transformation had been so complete that there was almost no connection between who she had been and who she had become. This was the thought that had begun to trouble her in the years that followed their marriage. It was subtle at first, just a whisper of doubt that she could push away whenever it arose. But it grew louder as time passed, as their children were born and grew, and became their own people with their own dreams and their own complicated relationships to the story of their parents' meeting. Their eldest daughter, Emma, was 17 now, and she had recently asked Sarah something that had sent a chill through her entire being. They had been sitting in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, just the two of them, while Marcus was at the office working on some acquisition that was consuming all of his time. Emma had been quiet, thoughtful, the way she always was before she asked something important. She had set down her coffee mug and looked directly at Sarah and asked, "Mom, do you ever regret it, not telling Dad sooner about the investment? Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you had been honest from the beginning?" The question had caught Sarah off guard, even though she knew she should have expected it. Emma was intelligent, perceptive, the kind of daughter who noticed the small tensions in a marriage, the unspoken things that lived between two people who loved each other, but who also carried secrets, even small ones, even ones that had been resolved years ago but never fully processed. Sarah had wanted to give Emma a simple answer. She had wanted to say, "No, of course not, everything worked out perfectly, everything was meant to be." But Emma deserved better than that. Emma deserved the truth, or at least a version of the truth that was closer to reality than the sanitized story that Sarah and Marcus had told to the world. So Sarah had taken a breath, and she had told Emma something that she had never fully articulated to anyone, not even to Marcus in all their years of marriage and counseling and late-night conversations. She had said, "I think regret is the wrong word, sweetheart, but I do think about it. I think about it more than I probably should. When you make a choice like that, when you put everything on the line for another person, when you keep something hidden from them, even if your intentions are good, even if it all works out in the end, there's a part of you that wonders if you made the right call. There's a part of you that carries that doubt forever, because the alternative timeline, the one where things went differently, will always exist in your imagination. And that alternative timeline can be seductive sometimes. It can make you wonder if things would have been better if you had just been honest, if you had just told him the truth and trusted him to do the right thing." Emma had listened to this with the kind of serious attention that made Sarah realize how much her daughter had inherited her own introspective nature. And then Emma had asked the follow-up question, the one that Sarah had been dreading, the one that cut right to the heart of everything. "But do you think he would have accepted the investment if you had told him the truth? Do you think Dad would have been willing to take money from someone he didn't know, someone who had just appeared in his life?" And that was the question that Sarah had never quite answered, even for herself. Because the truth was complicated. Marcus, in those early days of his company, had been proud. He had been determined to build something on his own, without help, without shortcuts, without relying on anyone but himself and his team. He had turned down investors before. He had walked away from deals that didn't feel right to him, even when he desperately needed the capital. He had a code, a set of principles that guided his decision-making, and those principles would likely have made it impossible for him to accept an investment from a stranger, no matter how compelling her pitch or how sound her business sense. But Sarah had known all of that, and yet she had done it anyway. She had anonymized her investment. She had created a shell company. She had moved money around in ways that were perfectly legal, but that were also deliberately obscuring, deliberately designed to keep Marcus from knowing the truth about where his capital was coming from. And while the investment had ultimately been instrumental in getting his company off the ground, while it had led to the success that had made him rich and powerful and influential, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had, in some fundamental way, violated his autonomy. She had made a choice for him. She had decided what she thought was best and had arranged the world around him in a way that made that happen. "I don't know," Sarah had finally answered Emma. "I honestly don't know. But I think that's the thing I had to come to terms with, honey. Not knowing. Accepting that there was a version of events where I was more honest and things still worked out, and another version where my honesty would have changed everything, and I would never actually get to know which one was true. So I had to choose to believe that the choice I made was the right one, because the alternative, living with regret and doubt and what-ifs, that was just going to poison everything." Emma had nodded slowly, and then she had said something that had stayed with Sarah ever since. "I think that's kind of sad, actually. I think it's sad that you have to just choose to believe something rather than actually knowing." And Sarah had realized that Emma was right. It was sad. It was a kind of sad that was inextricable from growing up, from making choices that couldn't be unmade, from stepping into an alternative timeline, and then spending the rest of your life wondering about the one you had left behind. The conversation with Emma had shaken something loose in Sarah, had cracked open something that she had carefully sealed away. In the weeks and months that followed, she found herself replaying memories, reconsidering moments that she thought she had made peace with years ago. She started paying attention to the small moments between her and Marcus, looking for signs of the resentment or the control that she feared might be lurking beneath the surface of their partnership. One evening, about 2 months after her conversation with Emma, Sarah and Marcus were sitting on the terrace of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Their children were inside, doing homework or watching television or engaged in whatever occupied their time these days. It was one of those rare moments of genuine quiet between them, the kind that they had once cherished, but that had become increasingly rare as their lives had grown more complicated and more full. Marcus reached over and took Sarah's hand. It was such a simple gesture, such a familiar one, but something about it in that moment felt charged with meaning. Sarah turned to look at him, and she found that he was looking out at the ocean, not at her, his face unreadable. "I've been thinking," Marcus said slowly, carefully, "about something that happened the other day. One of the board members mentioned that they had found some old paperwork from the early days of the company, from before we went public. Documents about the original investment from Ashford Capital." Sarah felt her entire body go rigid. Ashford Capital had been her shell company, the entity through which she had funneled her money into his business. She had been so careful to cover her tracks, but the documents themselves had never lied. The documents would always tell the truth if anyone ever looked closely enough. And, Sarah heard herself say, her voice smaller than she intended. Marcus finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were soft, not angry, not accusing, just deeply sad. "And I realized that I had never actually investigated where that money came from. I had been so busy building the company, so focused on making it work, that I had just accepted the capital and moved forward. I trusted the people handling the paperwork to vet the source. I trusted the process." But the board member mentioned something that caught my attention. She said that the shell company had a signature pattern, a way of handling transactions, that was very similar to how you managed your design business in those early days. Very similar handwriting on some of the documents, very similar attention to detail and financial planning. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was it. This was the moment she had both dreaded and, in some strange way, been waiting for. This was the moment when the truth would finally come crashing out, when the carefully constructed narrative would finally fracture. But before she could speak, before she could scramble for an explanation or an apology or some way to frame what she had done in the most acceptable light, Marcus continued. I didn't say anything to her, he said quietly. I didn't acknowledge that I had figured it out or that I suspected anything. Instead, I went home and I started thinking about it, really thinking about it. And I realized that I had known, on some level, for quite a while. I think I had always known, even before I consciously knew. Because it didn't make sense any other way, did it? The timing of that investment, the way it appeared exactly when I needed it most, the way it was structured to minimize risk, to protect the investor while still giving me the capital I needed. It all pointed to you. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus held up a hand, asking her silently to let him finish. And what I realized is that I had made a choice, a long time ago, to not pursue that line of thinking. I had made a choice to accept the gift, without asking too many questions about where it came from. Because on some level, I think I wanted to believe that the universe had provided for me. I wanted to believe that I had earned my success through intelligence and hard work and determination. I wanted to believe that I didn't owe my achievements to anyone but myself. And if I had admitted that the capital had come from you, if I had acknowledged that you had made a sacrifice, that you had believed in me enough to risk your own future on my vision, then I would have had to confront the fact that I was not a self-made man. That I was someone who had been helped, someone who had been believed in by another person, someone who had been given a chance. Sarah felt tears beginning to form, but she held them back, sensing that Marcus needed to say all of this, needed to get it all out. So I buried it, Marcus said. I buried the knowledge of what you had done, or at least I tried to. But it was always there, underneath everything, informing the way I felt about you, the way I treated you, the way I understood our relationship. Because I had this sense that I owed you something, that there was an imbalance in our partnership that I could never quite repay. And I think that's why I worked so hard, why I pushed myself to make the company grow exponentially, why I took every deal, why I never really allowed myself to rest or to enjoy the success. Because I was trying to earn the gift you had given me. I was trying to balance the scales. And the more successful I became, the more I felt like I was finally paying you back, finally making it so that your investment had been worth it, finally making it so that you didn't have to be the one who had sacrificed. Sarah couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled down her cheeks, and her voice came out hoarse and broken when she spoke. Marcus, I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything. That wasn't why I did it. I did it because I believed in you. Because I saw something in you that I thought the world needed to see. I know, Marcus said, and his own eyes were wet now, though his voice remained steady. And that's almost harder to accept than if you had done it for selfish reasons. If you had done it because you wanted to own a piece of me, or because you wanted power over me, or because you wanted to be thanked, I could have worked through that anger. But you did it out of pure faith. You did it out of genuine belief in my potential. And that's a gift so large, so complete, that there's no way to adequately repay it. There's no transaction that could ever balance it out. And I think that's what I've been grappling with all these years. The fact that I am fundamentally indebted to you in a way that goes beyond money, beyond success, beyond anything that can be quantified or repaid. You're not indebted to me, Sarah said firmly. That's not what this was about. I never told you because. She paused, searching for the right words, for a way to explain something that had seemed so clear in her mind for so long, but that now felt impossibly complicated. I never told you because I was afraid. I was afraid that if you knew, you would feel exactly the way you're describing now. I was afraid that it would poison what we had, that it would create exactly the kind of imbalance that you're talking about. So I kept it secret, thinking that I was protecting us, protecting you, protecting the purity of your achievement. But in keeping it secret, I created a different kind of imbalance. I created a lie that lived between us. Marcus reached over and wiped Sarah's tears away with his thumb. His hand was gentle, familiar, the hand of someone who had touched her thousands of times over the course of their life together. I know that now, he said softly. And I want you to know something. I spent years, and I mean genuinely, years feeling the weight of what you had given me, feeling like I was running on a treadmill trying to outrun the debt. But recently, I had a realization. I realized that the thing I was really running from wasn't the debt at all. It was the vulnerability of being loved that completely. It was the vulnerability of being known that thoroughly by another person. Because if you had loved me enough to invest in me when I was nobody, when I was just a struggling entrepreneur with big dreams and no capital, then that meant you saw something in me that I wasn't sure I saw in myself. And that was terrifying. Because if you were wrong about me, if I failed, then not only would I be failing myself, I would be failing you. I would be proving that your faith in me had been misplaced. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of this confession hanging between them like a physical thing. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky a deep purple edging toward black. In the distance, they could hear the sound of the ocean, the rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore, the same ocean that had brought them together all those years ago. "Do you forgive me?" Sarah asked finally, and the question felt both absurdly simple and impossibly large. Did he forgive her for the deception, for the hidden investment, for the years of silence, for the imbalance that her love had created? "There's nothing to forgive," Marcus said. "You saved me. You saved me when I was drowning in obscurity and self-doubt. You gave me a chance. And yes, you did it in a way that was dishonest. Yes, you made a choice for me that I didn't get to consciously make myself. But you did it out of love. And I think that's worth the cost of the deception. I think that's worth accepting that I'm not a self-made man, that I am someone who was helped, that I am someone who was believed in." He paused and then he added, "And maybe that's the real gift. Not the money, not the capital, but the knowledge that someone out there, someone who mattered, believed in me enough to take that kind of risk. To believe in me before I believed in myself." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there together as the night deepened around them. Neither of them spoke, but there was a quality to the silence that felt different than it had before. It felt lighter, more honest. It felt like they had finally begun to excavate something that had been buried for far too long, had finally begun to bring it into the light where it could be examined and understood, and perhaps accepted. But beneath the sense of relief, beneath the catharsis of finally having the conversation that Sarah had both dreaded and anticipated, there was something else. There was a new question forming, one that was even more complicated than the ones they had been wrestling with. The question was this: now that everything was out in the open, now that Marcus knew the truth about the investment, about her role in his success, about the way that her love had shaped and influenced the trajectory of his life, would things actually change? Would the knowledge that he now possessed alter the fundamental nature of their relationship? Sarah suspected that it would. She suspected that the comfortable narrative they had been living with, the story of the billionaire who had pulled a drowning woman from the ocean, the story of two people brought together by fate and destiny, would be harder to maintain now. The truth was messier, more complicated, more stained by human weakness and desperation, and the complicated ways that love could sometimes look like control, even when it was motivated by the purest of intentions. And she found herself thinking about Emma again, about her daughter's question, about whether she regretted not being honest from the beginning. Because the truth was that Sarah had done the right thing in saving Marcus's life that day at the beach. She had done the right thing in calling for help, in pulling him from the water, in keeping him alive. But she had also done something more complicated than that. She had taken it upon herself to shape his future, to direct the course of his life, to make choices on his behalf, and then to keep those choices secret. And while it had all worked out, while she had been right about his potential and his worthiness of investment, it had still been a violation of his autonomy. It had still been her imposing her will on the world, even if that imposition had been motivated by love. As they sat there in the darkness, Sarah realized that the ending of their story, if there even was an ending, was not going to be the simple, beautiful narrative that the media had constructed. It was not going to be a tale of cosmic intervention and fated meeting and love that transcended all obstacles. It was going to be something more ambiguous, more human, more true. It was going to be a story about two people learning to live with the complicated legacy of a choice that had seemed simple at the time, but that had revealed itself, over the course of years and decades, to be far more complex than anyone could have anticipated. It was going to be a story about the ways that love and deception could intertwine, about the way that good intentions could sometimes lead to outcomes that were not as clear-cut as they initially appeared. And it was going to be a story that continued unfolding, day by day, year by year, with no guarantee of a neat resolution or a perfect ending. Because that was the thing about real life, Sarah thought. It didn't conform to narrative structure. It didn't resolve neatly. It just continued, moment after moment, with all its complications and contradictions, and tangled threads of cause and effect woven together in ways that no one could fully untangle or understand, not even the people living it. The next morning arrived without fanfare. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus's penthouse, casting long shadows across marble floors that had been polished to a mirror shine. Sarah woke before dawn, as she often did, a habit born from decades of rising early to meet the demands of a life spent managing other people's money, other people's dreams, other people's futures. Marcus was already awake. She found him on the terrace, standing at the edge of the city he had built, or rather, the city that Sarah had helped him build. He held a cup of coffee in one hand, black, no sugar, the same way he had taken it for the past 15 years. His shoulders were tense. The muscles in his jaw worked silently as he stared out at the skyline, and Sarah understood without him saying anything that he had not slept. She approached quietly, but of course he heard her. Marcus heard everything. It was one of the things that had made him such a formidable businessman, an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings, of the subtle shifts in atmosphere and mood that most people missed entirely. "I've been thinking," he said before she could speak. His voice was hoarse, rough around the edges like something that had been weathered by wind and time. "About what you said, about autonomy, about the choice I never got to make." Sarah stood beside him at the railing. The city below was beginning to stir. Early morning traffic was starting to clog the arteries of the streets. Delivery trucks were making their rounds. The world was waking up, indifferent to the private wars being fought in penthouses and beach houses and quiet corners of the world. "I've been thinking too," she said softly. "Have you come to any conclusions?" There was something almost bitter in his tone, though she could tell he was trying to suppress it. Marcus had always been good at suppressing things. It was part of what had made him so successful. He could compartmentalize, could set aside his emotions and focus on the problem at hand with the laser precision of a surgeon. But there were limits to that ability, and Sarah suspected he had reached them. "No," she admitted. "I don't think this is the kind of problem that has conclusions. I think it's the kind of problem that just sits with you, that you learn to live with." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. His coffee had gone cold in his hands, but he didn't drink it. He just held it, staring down into the dark liquid as though it might contain answers that the real world refused to provide. "Do you know what I've been thinking about all night?" he asked finally. "I've been thinking about the alternative, about what would have happened if you hadn't been at that beach that day, if you hadn't decided to save my life." "You would have drowned," Sarah said simply. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "I would have drowned. I was in such a dark place back then. You know that. You were there, even though I didn't know you were there. You saw what I was going through. The company was failing. My investors were pulling out. I was going to lose everything. I had 6 months of operating capital left, maybe less, and I was seriously considering whether it was even worth it to keep fighting." Sarah had known this, of course. She had known every detail of his financial situation, every conversation he had had with every investor, every late night he had spent at the office trying to find a way to make it all work. She had known because she had hired people to tell her, because she had wanted to understand the full scope of his circumstances before she made her decision to invest. "I remember," she said. "What you were saving that day wasn't just my life," Marcus continued, his voice growing quieter. "You were saving the man I was going to become, you were saving the company, you were saving the legacy. All of it hinged on that moment. If I had drowned, none of this would exist. Not the company, not the fortune, not the empire, none of it." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It wasn't anger, exactly, though there was certainly anger there, simmering beneath the surface. It was something more complicated than that. It was a kind of vertigo, a sense of standing on the edge of something vast and incomprehensible, trying to understand the fundamental nature of causality and consequence, and the way that single moments could reshape entire worlds. "So when you saved my life," Marcus said slowly, "you didn't just save me, you also created me. You shaped me. You decided that I was worthy of existing, and then you went further. You decided that I was worthy of succeeding. You made that choice for me, and you never gave me the opportunity to refuse." "I know," Sarah said, and there was nothing more to say after that because what he was articulating was not a question, not really. It was a statement of fact, a truth that they were both going to have to find a way to live with. The sun continued to rise. The city continued to wake. The world went on, indifferent to the personal revolutions unfolding in high places. Over the next few days, something shifted between them. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of thing that would register on any external meter. They still shared a bed. They still had breakfast together. They still maintained the basic rhythms and rituals that made up a long marriage. But there was a distance now, a thin veil of formality that had crept in between them like fog rolling in from the ocean. Sarah found herself noticing things she had taken for granted for years. The way Marcus touched her had become more careful, as though he was afraid of what might happen if he allowed himself to be too familiar. The conversations they had became more measured, more cautious. They discussed logistics and practical matters, the schedule for upcoming board meetings, the renovation of one of their properties, the guest list for a charity gala, but they avoided anything that might touch on the fundamental questions that now hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. One evening, about a week after Marcus had discovered the truth, they attended a charity function in the city. It was an elaborate affair, the kind of event where Manhattan's elite gathered to write large checks and congratulate themselves on their generosity. Sarah had attended hundreds of such events over the years. They were part of the landscape of her life, part of the territory she navigated with the ease of long practice. But this one felt different. As they moved through the crowd, Marcus in an immaculate tuxedo, Sarah in a gown that had cost more than most people's annual salary, she found herself hyper-aware of how the other guests responded to him, the way they sought him out, the way they hung on his words, the way they wanted to be near him, wanted to bask in the reflected glow of his success and his wealth and his power. It was intoxicating, watching it happen, and it was also deeply depressing. Because Sarah could see now, more clearly than she ever had before, what she had created. Not just a successful company, not just a wealthy man. She had created a god, in a sense. A figure that inspired reverence and awe, and a kind of desperate desire to be in his orbit. And none of these people, none of the politicians and celebrities and business leaders who circled around him like planets around a sun, had any idea that his entire existence, his entire trajectory, was built on a foundation of Sarah's deception. At one point during the evening, a journalist approached them. He was young, hungry, the kind of man who had built his career on finding the human interest angle in stories about the obscenely wealthy. Sarah recognized him immediately. She made it her business to be aware of people like this, people who might prove dangerous if they got too close to certain truths. "Marcus," the journalist said, extending his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's been a while, how are you?" "Good," Marcus said, shaking his hand with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to performing this ritual. "What brings you here tonight?" "Same thing that brings everyone here," the journalist said. "A chance to see how the other half lives, but I'm particularly interested in talking to you. I've been working on a piece about self-made billionaires. The American dream, the pulling yourself up by your bootstraps narrative, and you're one of the purest examples of that we have, from nothing to this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings, the glittering chandeliers, the thousands of dollars worth of wine being consumed without a second thought. Sarah felt her entire body go rigid. She could see Marcus noticing it out of the corner of his eye, could see him registering her reaction and trying to understand what it meant. "I appreciate that," Marcus said smoothly, but there was something new in his voice now. Something that hadn't been there before. A hesitation. An awareness that the narrative he had been telling, the story of the self-made man, the entrepreneur who had pulled himself up from nothing through sheer force of will and determination, was no longer quite as solid as it had once been. "Would you be interested in doing a longer interview?" the journalist asked. "I think there's a real story here, the story of how you built your empire, the people who believed in you." The early investors who took a chance on you when no one else would. There was a pause. Sarah could sense the moment when Marcus realized what was happening. He was being offered an opportunity to tell his story, to lock in the narrative that the world had settled on. And at the same time, he was being asked to confront the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of that narrative. "I'll have my people call you," Marcus said finally, but there was no enthusiasm in his voice. The journalist smiled, said his goodbyes, and moved on to other prey. Sarah and Marcus stood in their spot for a moment, surrounded by the glittering crowd, and neither of them said anything. Later, when they returned to the penthouse, Marcus went directly to his study. Sarah followed him, not bothering to change out of her dress, not caring that the expensive fabric was being wrinkled by her movement. "You're wondering if I'm going to tell him," Marcus said before she could speak. He was standing at the window again, in that posture she had come to recognize. Hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the city below. "Aren't you?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Marcus said, and there was something almost vulnerable in his admission. "A week ago, the answer would have been an absolute no. I would have protected the narrative at all costs. I would have understood that the truth would be destructive, not just to me but to the company, to the investors, to everyone who believed in the story of my success. But now—" He trailed off, searching for words that didn't seem to exist. "But now," Sarah prompted. "Now I'm not sure what the lie is anymore," Marcus said. He turned to face her, and she could see the exhaustion in him, the toll that the knowledge had taken over the past week. "Is the lie the story that I told the world, or is the lie the story I've been telling myself? That I built this on my own, that I earned this through my own efforts, that I was the architect of my own destiny." "You did build it," Sarah said quietly. "You did earn it. The money came from me, but the work was yours. The vision was yours. The decisions were yours. I didn't build the company. I only gave you the capital to try. And I bought your shares because I believed in you, yes, but I also bought them because you succeeded in using that capital to create something real, something substantial, something that was worth investing in." "But I never knew that," Marcus said harshly. "I never knew any of that. I thought I was building this on my own. I thought every success was the result of my own intelligence and my own determination and my own worth. And now I'm finding out that it was all built on a lie, that I owe my entire existence to someone else's intervention, that I'm not actually self-made at all. I'm manufactured. I'm constructed. I'm a product." Sarah flinched at the word, but she didn't argue with it. Because in a way, it was true. She had constructed him. She had taken the raw materials of his talent and his potential and his desperation, and she had shaped them into something that the world wanted. Something that could be sold, something that could be celebrated and admired and elevated to the status of an icon. "Is that what you believe?" Sarah asked. "That you're just a product? That none of your accomplishments mean anything because they didn't come from pure autonomy?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He sat down in his leather chair, the one he used when he wanted to think through complicated problems, and Sarah settled into the chair across from him. It was a posture they had adopted many times over the years. It meant that they were about to have a serious conversation. It meant that they were moving into difficult territory. "I don't know what I believe anymore," Marcus said finally. "That's the honest answer. A week ago, I had a coherent narrative. I had a story that made sense of my life and my success and my place in the world. And now that narrative has shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I can't figure out how to put it back together. Or if I even want to." "We could try to construct a new narrative," Sarah suggested carefully. "We could tell the truth. We could explain what happened and why it happened and what it means. We could rebuild the story in a way that acknowledges the complexity of the situation." "You mean we could destroy everything I've built?" Marcus said flatly. "We could admit to the world that the billionaire entrepreneur they've been celebrating is actually a fraud. That he's been living his entire life on the basis of a lie. That he only succeeded because someone else decided to make him succeed." "Is that really what people would see?" Sarah asked. "Or would they see a story about two people whose lives became entangled in complicated ways? About a woman who loved a man so much that she was willing to risk everything to help him succeed? About a man who, even with that help, still had to do the work, still had to prove himself, still had to create something real and substantial? I don't think most people have the capacity for that kind of nuance, Marcus said bitterly. I think people want their stories simple. They want their villains clearly marked and their heroes unblemished. They want to believe in the myth of the self-made man because it gives them hope that they can do the same. And if I expose that myth as a lie, if I admit that I had help, that I was rescued, that my success was not entirely the product of my own efforts, then I'm destroying not just my own narrative, but the narrative that millions of people have built their lives around. He was right, and Sarah knew it. The mythology of the self-made billionaire was one of the most powerful narratives in American culture. It was the story that people told themselves when they were working 70-hour weeks, when they were sacrificing time with their families, when they were making moral compromises in the service of ambition. It was the story that justified the inequality, that made it seem as though the people at the top had earned their position through superior talent and determination and work ethic. If that story was revealed to be a lie, if the architects of that story admitted that they had never actually been truly self-made, that they had all had help, then what happened to the entire edifice? So what do we do? Sarah asked. Do we just pretend that this never happened? Do we go back to normal? Do we maintain the fiction? I don't think I can, Marcus said slowly. And I don't think you would want me to, not really. Because if we did that, if we just went back to pretending, then we would be accepting that the lie is more important than the truth. We would be saying that your deception was justified, that my ignorance was preferable to knowledge, that the stability of the narrative matters more than the integrity of the people living it. He stood up and walked to the bookshelves that lined his study. They were filled with books that Marcus had accumulated over the years. Some he had read, some he had purchased but never gotten around to, some he had bought simply because they looked impressive. Sarah had always found it slightly amusing, the way that wealthy people used books as decoration, as props in the theater of their own lives. Marcus pulled down a volume at random. It was a biography of some historical figure whose name Sarah didn't recognize, and flipped through it without really looking at the words. I've been thinking about Emma, he said. Your daughter. About how she asked you whether you regretted not being honest from the beginning, and I've been wondering what I would say to her if she asked me the same question. What I would tell her about what's right and what's wrong when it comes to deception and love, and trying to help someone you care about. What would you tell her? Sarah asked. I don't know, Marcus admitted. I honestly don't know. Because on one level, I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful that you saved my life. I'm grateful that you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I'm grateful that you were willing to take a risk on me, that you saw potential in me that the rest of the world refused to acknowledge. All of that is true, and it matters, and it's not diminished by the fact that you did it deceptively. He turned back to face her, and his expression was complex, a mixture of anger and gratitude and confusion, and something that looked almost like sadness. But at the same time, he continued, I'm angry. I'm angry that you made a decision about my life without consulting me. I'm angry that you watched me struggle and didn't tell me that you could help. I'm angry that you shaped my entire trajectory without my consent. And I'm angry that even now, even after you've told me the truth, I can't quite escape the sense that I'm living in a story that someone else wrote for me. That I'm a character in your narrative, rather than the author of my own. Sarah felt tears beginning to form, though she tried to fight them back. She had known this was coming. On some level, she had always known that this moment would come, that Marcus would eventually arrive at this place of moral clarity and emotional honesty. And yet it still hurt, hearing it articulated so plainly. I'm sorry, she said, and the words felt inadequate, felt like the kind of thing that should be said, but couldn't possibly be sufficient to repair the damage that had been done. I'm genuinely sorry, not because I regret saving your life, not because I regret believing in you, but because I did it the wrong way. Because I let fear drive my decisions instead of trust. Because I convinced myself that the ends justified the means. That deception was acceptable if it was motivated by love. Love should have been enough, Marcus said quietly. If you really loved me, you should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth. You should have believed that I could handle it. You should have given me the chance to make my own choices, even if those choices might have been different from the ones you would have wanted me to make. The apartment was very quiet. Outside, the city continued its endless noise and motion, the eternal churning of millions of lives intersecting and colliding and moving past each other. But inside the penthouse, there was only silence and the weight of things that couldn't be unsaid, and consequences that couldn't be undone. "What happens now?" Sarah asked finally. "What do you want to happen?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He set the book he had been holding back on the shelf and moved to the window again. It was late night now, and the city below had taken on that glittering, dreamlike quality it acquired when viewed from a great height in darkness. It looked almost unreal, almost like a representation of a city rather than an actual city, a painting or a photograph rather than a living, breathing thing. "I need some time," Marcus said. "I need to figure out who I actually am beneath all of this. I need to separate the man I became from the man you helped me become. I need to understand what parts of me are authentically mine and what parts are products of your intervention." "How long?" Sarah asked, and there was an edge of fear in her voice that she couldn't quite suppress. "I don't know," Marcus said. "Weeks, months, maybe longer. I'm not saying that I'm leaving you. I'm not saying that this is over. But I can't just go back to normal. I can't just pretend that this revelation hasn't fundamentally altered the way I understand myself and the world, and what our relationship actually is." Sarah nodded, though he wasn't looking at her to see it. "Okay," she said. "Take whatever time you need." Over the following weeks, a strange new rhythm established itself in their lives. They continued to live together, continued to share physical space, but the intimacy that had characterized their relationship for so long seemed to have evaporated. They were polite to each other, courteous, the way strangers on an elevator might be polite and courteous. But there was no real connection anymore, or at least, the connection had become fragile and uncertain in ways that it had never been before. Marcus threw himself into work with a kind of desperate intensity. He started spending more time at the office, more time in meetings, more time engaged in the business of running his empire. Sarah sometimes wondered if he was doing it because he genuinely needed to, or if he was doing it to avoid being alone with her, to avoid having conversations that might force him to confront the complicated questions that had no clear answers. She, meanwhile, found herself spending more time with Emma. Her daughter had always been somewhat distant since Sarah had revealed her investment in Marcus's company, as though the revelation of her mother's capacity for deception had cast a shadow over their relationship that neither of them knew quite how to dispel. But now, with Marcus emotionally withdrawn, and the penthouse feeling like a space divided between two separate people, Sarah found herself drawn to Emma's apartment, to her daughter's company, to the possibility of rebuilding some kind of honest connection. "He's angry," Sarah said one afternoon, sitting in Emma's kitchen watching her daughter prepare lunch. "And rightfully so, he has every right to be angry." "But you're not sorry," Emma said. It wasn't a question, she knew her mother too well. "No," Sarah admitted. "I'm not sorry for saving his life, I'm not sorry for believing in him, I'm not sorry for the outcome, but I am sorry for the way I did it. I'm sorry for the deception. I'm sorry for taking agency away from him." Emma set down her knife and looked at her mother directly. "Do you think he'll forgive you?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "I think there's a difference between forgiving someone and deciding to move past something. Marcus might decide that he can move past what I did. He might even decide that he loves me enough to not let it destroy our relationship. But forgive me, I'm not sure that's possible. I violated his autonomy in a fundamental way. I made decisions for him without his consent. Those are the kinds of things that don't get forgiven. They just get accommodated." Emma finished preparing lunch. A simple salad, some bread, some cheese, and they sat down to eat. They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Emma said, "I've been thinking about something you told me once. You said that love sometimes means doing things that the other person might not want you to do, things that they might not even understand, because you know it's in their best interest." "I remember," Sarah said, "and I still think that's true. But I also think there's a line. There's a difference between making difficult decisions in someone's interest and making decisions for them without their knowledge or consent. I crossed that line. I knew I was crossing it, and I did it anyway." "Because you loved him," Emma said. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "Because I loved him, and because I was afraid, and because I was arrogant enough to believe that I knew what was best for him better than he did. All of those things were true at the same time. The conversation hung between them, unresolved. Sarah thought about the years of deception, the careful construction of a false narrative, the way she had inserted herself into Marcus's life with such precision and care that he had never even suspected that she was there. She thought about all the moments when she could have told him the truth, when she could have said something, when she could have given him the information he needed to make choices about his own life. And she thought about why she hadn't done it. Not just fear or arrogance, though those were certainly part of it, but also something deeper, something about the need to be needed, the need to be the person who made things happen, the person who arranged circumstances, the person who controlled the narrative. Was that love, or was it something else entirely, something that merely wore the mask of love? Sarah didn't have an answer. Over the next month, she made a decision. She couldn't control what Marcus felt or how he processed his anger and his sense of betrayal. But she could control her own actions. She could decide to live more honestly, to stop trying to manipulate circumstances, to allow other people the dignity of making their own choices, even if she didn't approve of those choices. She started by calling a press conference. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Sarah had rented a small auditorium downtown, and she had invited a select group of journalists, including the young man who had approached Marcus at the charity gala. She had also prepared a statement, typed it out herself, reviewed it multiple times, edited it until she felt like it captured as much truth as she could manage to articulate in words. When Marcus found out what she was doing, he tried to stop her. He came home from the office in the middle of the day, which was unusual enough that Sarah knew something had happened, that someone had informed him of her plans. "What are you doing?" he demanded. His voice was sharp, his face flushed with anger and what looked like fear. "I heard through my assistant that you've scheduled a press conference. Please tell me that you're not about to do what I think you're about to do." "I'm going to tell the truth," Sarah said calmly. They were standing in the living room of the penthouse, and the afternoon light was streaming through the windows, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. "I'm going to tell people about the investment, about how I came to know you, about everything." "You can't," Marcus said, and for the first time since he had learned the truth, she saw something like desperation in his expression. "Sarah, you can't do this. Do you understand what it will do? It will destroy everything. The company, the investors, the narrative, all of it will collapse." "Maybe it should," Sarah said. "Maybe the narrative was always compromised. Maybe it's better to acknowledge that than to continue pretending." "This isn't about the narrative," Marcus said harshly. "This is about you. This is about you trying to control the story one more time. You've already shaped my life beyond recognition, and now you're trying to reshape it again, to make it conform to some vision of what you think is right and true and good." "No," Sarah said, and she realized as she said it that it was true. "Actually, this is about giving up control. This is about deciding that I don't get to determine how this story is told. I'm going to tell my version of it, and then the world will tell theirs, and Marcus will tell his, and we'll all have to live with the various interpretations and the different ways that different people understand what happened." "I don't consent to this," Marcus said. "I'm asking you directly not to do this." "I know," Sarah said. "And I'm sorry, but I have to. I can't keep living with the deception. I can't keep allowing the lie to stand. And I think, deep down, you don't want me to either." Marcus left the apartment without responding. He didn't say goodbye. He just walked to the door, paused for just a moment as though considering whether he should turn back, and then he left. Sarah didn't know if he would come back. She went to the press conference at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The auditorium was half full. She had expected more press coverage, but apparently, the story wasn't quite compelling enough to draw massive crowds. Still, there were enough people there, enough cameras, enough faces looking at her with interest and curiosity as she took her place at the podium. She looked out at the assembled journalists, and she thought about all the ways this story could be told, all the different narratives that could be constructed from the raw material of her confession. She thought about headlines and think pieces, and think tanks analyzing the implications of her revelation. She thought